Hello, everybody. Chris Jerome of the Radical Independent Facebook page here with Zachery Elwood, an authority on depolarization and reducing the toxicity of our politics. And it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks,
And
Chris. I appreciate it and appreciate you calling me an authority. Thank you.
well, Zach, I gave a little intro. Do you mind going into a little more detail about yourself and how you got involved in this area?
Yeah, I'm kind of a non-traditional person maybe in this space because, I had a psychology and behavior podcast, people who read people that I got into via poker tells. I used to be a professional poker player, and
I
that
saw that.
writing about poker tells led me to making the psychology and behavior podcast. And then, with the political dysfunction and political polarization in America, I started going down the rabbit hole of like, hey, what's the deal with our divides? And, trying to understand the different narratives and trying to understand why we were so angry and how those things grow. So that's what led me to investigating that on my podcast and interviewing various people, including some, people I saw as highly angry themselves about various things, like including a militant Antifa kind of rioter person in Portland, and but mostly people who had opinions and that were professionals on political polarization, interviewing various people. And then I tried to summarize my learnings. Not that I thought I was some genius on polarization, but it was more like my attempt to summarize that work I'd done on the podcast by writing the books, which includes Diffusing American Anger, and then my book after that, How Contempt Destroys Democracy. They're very much similar, but the later one was for a more liberal, more focused for a liberal anti-Trump audience, but they have the contain the same ideas. But
Right.
yeah, that's kind of like the long story short. But as a lot of things go, digging into the polarization field, it was much more complex and a lot of things to think about in that area versus when I started thinking like, oh, this, it won't be as complex as it is. But yeah, that's kind of the long story short of how a guy went down the rabbit hole on that and wrote some books, which ended up getting, I haven't sold many copies, but they did get some nice critical responses from a few people that I respected. So that was nice.
Yeah, I've read some great reviews, and so it's interesting that you got your you kind of didn't start with the politics; it just kind of went that direction, and then
Yeah,
sounds
I
like
wouldn't even. I'm not a. I don't consider myself really a political person. I never have, and I kind of ended up thinking that made me a good person to actually delve into it because I don't really have a lot of, you know, passions in that
right.
area.
I think that's
I don't.
great
Yeah.
as an observer. Sometimes you got to sort of detach, and you have a different perspective as someone who's like in the day-to-day retail politics grind. You
Hmm.
get people who have a fresh perspective, so I think that's
Hmm.
awesome.
Hmm.
Well, that leads into some of the bigger issues that we face today. I feel like we share some similar thoughts about some of the causes, effects, and I don't know, potential prescriptions, basically. What
Yeah.
what are some of the conclusions that you've come across, or interesting things in terms of why why has the past 10, maybe even 20 years been uniquely every poll, all the surveys, all the research that's coming out, it points to that, to increasing polarization, extremism. The politics is getting nasty. All these things. So, what are some big takeaways for you in that area?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I think the thing that I really try to emphasize in my work is getting people to see how the contempt that we feel for each other is so much the main part of this. And we tend to focus on the issues, we tend to focus on the stances, but I think when you start to see how contempt and emotions are the driving force behind this, which and those things lead into us having like more polarized, more at odds stances, because we end up, if we hate the other side or disgusted by them, we're more likely to support people who are taking harder and harder lines against the other side. So we end up in these polarized spirals where the emotions, the contempt influence the stances, and the stances in turn influence the emotions, and it's kind of a self-sustaining kind of engine that drives us further and further apart. So I
So,
think,
quick
Yeah.
question. Am I right in the sense that a lot of times it's not even a political disagreement, but more of an emotional resentment towards that group? Because it seems like the politics change,
I,
but this tribal emotionalism, it's more of a kind of a tribal resentment,
yeah,
contempt
a
against this
feud.
group
Yeah.
than the actual issue.
Yeah,
Have
I
you
do. I
found
do
that?
think yeah, seeing that aspect of conflict, I think is hugely important. And I think when people dig into these topics, I mean, there's many things we know about how conflict works that are pretty well established and that map over to many other conflicts, like people that study conflicts. And that was the thing I was interested in delving into for my podcast, is interviewing people about that. It's like we know a lot about how conflict works, and it is a lot of this group, team-based thinking, us versus them thinking, which and that may not be obvious to us because we tend to tell these stories. We confabulate stories. We build these stories about how the other side's stances are all representing the badness of the other side, right? And our side stances are all representing the goodness of our side. But in a different
Narratives.
world, you can imagine different combinations of those stances, right? Like a
Right.
lot of the way the stances are built are kind of random, and there's not like we tend to think of there's this overlaying like left right spectrum and we put everything on the spectrum, but it's like when you actually, for people that have actually studied this, like Michael Macy is a good example, studying kind of like the randomness of how stances form and how they get associated with one group or another in sometimes random ways, and then people build stories about how this stance is built into the goodness of our side, or
Right.
this stance is built into the badness of their side, right? So we're storytellers at the end of the day. Humans are storytellers, and we tell all of these stories, and these stories can be very distorted and can be conflict amplifying because we tend to build these stories about how it's this grand fight between these two,
Right.
ideological forces, and good versus bad on this plenitude of the multitude of issues. But I think the reality is much more complex than that. That a lot of these things kind of like happen randomly, and we assign various stories to them. And people can obviously have a mix of all sorts of stances that don't align by the stereotypical, left versus right kind of a framework, which I think is mostly a complete illusion. The way a lot of people use it to try to encapsulate a range of
It's
issues.
so
So it's
yeah.
just to say that the stories we tell end up amplifying the conflict itself and amplifying the widening of the stances, and all these things. It's a self reinforcing engine. Yeah.
Right. So that story aspect is interesting. It's almost like narratives, right? You hear that a lot these days that people are just kind of following various narratives or something like that. But the point you bring up about sort of the simplistic binary left right thing is something that I talk about a lot too on the Radical Independent. And are you familiar with a book called The Myth of Left and Right by the Lewis brothers?
Yeah, I interviewed Hiram Lewis for my podcast, actually. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
were mentioning, you were saying that, that's what came to my mind.
Hmm.
They do a good job of kind of breaking that down and how
Yeah,
it's
and I
more of
think
a social distinction than an ideological one. So that's a great
yeah,
subject.
I do think, I mean, honestly, I think that book of theirs is theoretically like the most important book on politics in the last 20 years, just because it examines such a foundational thing that so many people
Right.
don't question, but that is baked into so much of our politics and discourse that I agree with them. It's largely or even entirely an illusory conception, right?
It really is. So obviously the issues we face today in the political landscape very complex and everything. But what do you think are some of the main drivers with I don't know, that's
I mean,
creating
yeah.
these different stories? Or I know social media is a big thing. Technology and
Yeah.
social media has really I don't know if it was ever meant to bring us together, but it kind of had the opposite effect in a lot of ways. And so are there other things, social media, maybe other things?
I do think, I every once in a while I'll talk to somebody because I did write a piece about how the internet deranges and divides us, and I do think that is a huge factor in like amplifying some of the natural tendencies we have towards conflict. It's like obviously humans are good at getting into conflict spirals, but it's like I do believe that the internet has been a big factor in amplifying that, just because it creates all of these bubble effects. It amplifies more emotional language that gets the most attention, gets shared the most. It creates a place that stores all of the insults from the other side, and that we can find the insults from the quote other side anytime we want, and we can share those and we can insult other people. So it just it basically puts the way I thought of it in my piece, I basically thought that it put human social the darker aspects of human social psychology kind of on amphetamines. It just like amplified them that much more, So
Yeah.
I do see that as
And it
a
is like a
big
drug,
driver. But
right?
otherwise, I think it's
So, I talk about a lot of my page talks about electoral reform, stuff like that, systemic tweaks and changes we need, campaign electoral reform. But another part of that is the social cultural aspect, right? And that's kind of the stuff that we're talking about here. But what about identity obsession? Is that an issue? Because I talk about that a little bit, in my opinion. I guess it's just sort of a postmodern thing, but we've internalized, we've created these identities tied to political ideas and stuff like that. Where, and if you're talking about something or mildly critical in some way, it's a complete assault on that person's being, I guess. I see that a
Mhm.
lot. I see it on the populist right, the populist left. Like I said, very tribal, but and then clinging to like these identity, this is who I am, and it creates a rigidity and a certainty. And am I off base with that, or is that something that you, I don't know, is that a nor is that a is that an, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, in my book, especially the one aimed at liberal slash Democrat Americans, I try to help them see how some of the identity related things on the left can be seen as divisive and unreasonable, even if they don't end up agreeing with that. I wanted to help people see how people can see those things as as many people have written about it, including quite liberal people have written about the kind of pessimistic ways that how those things can come across, the more identity focused politics, like Mark Lillo's book, The Once and Future Liberal, that was a liberal critiquing the liberal side. There's also Richard Rorty's book, Achieving Our Country, which talks about the pessimism of a lot of, liberal associated views. But I do think it's important for everybody to, because I think it happens, like you said, I think in general, what conflict does is tends to tie people to their political identities more in various ways. And I think both sides are kind of immune to seeing how that happens on their side or for them, right? They can see it easily on the other side, but it's harder to see how, we might, I might being dragged into some of the same things, even as they manifest differently, right? They can manifest in very different ways, which I do think they do. But I think that there's a fundamental aspect of, being more and more seeing insults to one's political group, taking that very personally in various ways. And on the left, it might that it might take the form of being related to race or culture or things too.
Right.
But I do think there's this conflict brings that out of us, the tendency to take everything more and more personally in sort of a group sense.
And so, the Radical Independent is we're a nonpartisan page, and we tend to be pretty moderate, and that's kind of an aspect is being somewhat detached from that team sport partisanship and that sort of emotional tribalism. It does give you that different perspective, and so I feel like I could reach more people, or at least educate, inform people who are maybe kind of more involved in that day to day sort of political partisanship, because it just seems like you can get lost in that area. So, do you see election reform playing any sort of role to help deal with these issues? I know we're sort of talking about the social cultural aspect, but it's kind of, to me, it's the yin and the yang. I talk about both on the page. I feel like we need both. It's kind of hard to do one without the other. Do you have any insights on, I talk about ranked choice voting, or some
Mhm.
sort of proportional voting. Open primaries is a big thing, but I prefer something called independent primaries, which is new and completely no one even knows what that is. Um,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
term limits, ending gerrymandering, all these like sort of systemic tweaks that we can do.
Right.
there's a good quote. I can't remember who it's from, but a bad system will beat a good person every time. So we can change hearts and minds, but at the end of the day, if we're operating within a flawed system, what are your thoughts on
Yeah.
election reform kind of playing a role with some of our social cultural problems?
Yeah, no, it is like two dimensions. It's like, as you say, it's the cultural, social change aspect, which is what I've focused on, and then there's the changing the system aspect. And like you say, those things could, work together in various ways. I think there's actually a good talk you might like that I had on my podcast with I don't know if you know who David Foster is. He wrote a book called Moderates of the World Unite, which was kind of a
Hmm.
tongue-in-cheek title, but in his book he was focusing on like media system, adjustments we might make, systemic changes in the media, and we actually had a discussion about like those two dimensions of like me focusing on the cultural change aspects and him focusing on the systemic change, which I thought was a good discussion, even just to see how those things can relate and be different. But I think I'm not opposed to any specific systemic change. Like you said, I think they can theoretically work in concert, and it's just not something I focus on because I think the focus on the cultural change part is almost like we need to get enough people interested in changing something at all before we
Right.
can change something.
Right.
Like theoretically, like, we're so polarized. Could we even come up with legislation that everybody could mostly get behind, that they wouldn't argue over and that they wouldn't become polarized over? At some point you might need to get people interested in the problem and the solution enough itself to even like get on the same page of solving the problem, right? So that's kind of like how I see them working together. It's like theoretically, yeah, if we could pass something that would definitely some systemic thing that could definitely help, that would be great. I'm just pessimistic that we could get enough people on the same page to like get the systems in
Mhm.
place in the first place. But that it could happen easier than I think, though, because we've already seen, sometimes they do get more aligned than we think on some of
Right.
these bills or whatever it may be. But that's kind of, yeah, I think we need both, but I don't pretend to be an expert on the systemic change aspect.
I talk about an inflection point, and that sounds kind of like what you're saying is that, and so the radical independent, I'm posting news and articles, and I'm just spreading information, trying to educate, trying to inform, trying to get the word out, stuff like that. But I talk about reaching an inflection point, and it's a growing movement. And the page has grown a lot. There's a lot of great groups out there, real boots on the ground groups. I'm just a mouthpiece, but people actually, doing the real work, trying to get some of these election reforms and stuff in there. I feel like it's a growing movement, but I talk about an inflection point where at some point we're going to
Hmm.
see a tipping point, right?
Hmm.
Suddenly it's going to become a top three issue, and enough people are going to, gravitate towards that, and we're going to see sort of exponential growth at that point in terms of
Yeah.
I'm trying to be optimistic, right?
The hunger, I mean,
But
the demand is there, as you say. I mean,
yeah.
I've seen that firsthand, like when I worked for this nonprofit, builders, aka Starts With Us. I mean, we saw that, so it was very easy to get people to sign up. When we advertised for a group that was trying to lower the divides in America, it had a very effective. They had very effective, you know, advertising for that because there is a real demand, and I've seen that
Yeah.
firsthand too. When talking to people, it's like I think people just don't know how to, talk about it. There's various like pitfalls
Right.
when you
uh
broach that topic. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the number of independents is growing tremendously now. Apparently, they've surpassed Republicans and Democrats. The exhausted majority, the politically homeless, tired people who are tired of businesses. There seems to be people are receptive, but it's like you said. I don't know if they see a way to get from here to there.
Yeah, and
They sort of they feel like they want change, but they don't know how that can happen, and that's kind of where I think you and myself and others can kind of give some people some possible not solutions, I guess, but ways to make changes and mitigate some of the worst aspects of what we're
although
seeing.
although I imagine, the whole independence thing is also really nuanced too, because I know that, you know I think some people who call themselves independents might just be like, the Republican Party or the Democrat Party isn't hardcore enough for me or something. Like
Right.
they actually want, they want more like polarization or something. But yeah, but I think a lot of people that who say they're independents, or we know from polls that a lot of people are fed up with the toxicity
Right.
and the constant demonization of the other side. We know that from polls. So there's a real hunger out there for sure. Yeah.
So, one more quick question here. Why does it matter? I mean, obviously, we want a more harmonious society. We want a more functional government. But really, what's at stake here? Like, what? Why do we need these changes? Why do
Hmm.
we need to be better, get better? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think, I mean, for me, especially like I said, I'm not somebody who has a lot of, political dogs in the fight. I'm relatively passionless as those things go. I mean, I have my own preferences, but I'm not a big proselytizer on the things I believe in. But I think for me, the things that got me into it, that make me, scared, that make me see what's in it for myself is, with more toxic polarization comes more stupidity. I think no matter who's in charge, it's just like when you have a system where high contempt team-based thinking is common. It just creates a dumber outcome where it creates more political dysfunction, which filters down in various ways, making it unable for us to solve problems as a society, as a the government can't get on the same page with anything. Nothing can they can't figure out a smart path forward because the choices are always so like at odds, and they can't like you know pull their pull their thinking and get on the same page and work together to solve problems. So I think it leads to outcomes that just basically hurt us all. Like it makes life tougher for all of us, regardless of which which group is winning the war at any given time. It makes it so that the choices that are made in government and even elsewhere, I'd say in business and elsewhere, just lead to dumber outcomes and more dysfunction in society. And we can't solve the things that are bothering people, like the failure of the middle class, or the weakening of the middle class, just all the kind of problems that every day people struggle with every day that they want solved. All those things just become harder, and I think we just kind of like start veering down the path towards idiocracy the more team based we as a society we are.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
hey, thanks for coming on, Zach, and helping us at least try to make a little more sense of what's going on. And it's a big issue, and no easy solutions, I don't think. And it's not going to happen overnight, but I guess we keep pushing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Chris. Thanks for the interest. Yeah.
All right. Thanks.